My name is Ivy Scott. I am a community engagement reporter with the Marshall Project. And I just want to thank everybody here for joining us for this panel on extreme heat in what we call carceral settings. And so that includes prisons, jails, and immigration detention centers. We have an incredible slate of panelists here who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves very shortly. Before I do that, I just also want to introduce my co-conspirator, Michelle, who is our coordinator and editor of Investigate This. And so that is sort of like the anchor for this webinar and also for the accompanying toolkit, which we will make available in the chat. It is one of a handful of toolkits we have to help reporters, researchers, really anyone in the community who wants to dig deep into these issues in their own communities. And so this panel is really just a part of that to help people better understand how they can investigate the issue of extreme heat in prisons, jails, and detention centers in your community. So with that being said, I am going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. The one thing I do want everyone to know is that about halfway through this panel, we are going to pivot to questions from you all. So please, as we are talking, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A section. I will mention this in the chat as well, but please, when you ask questions, include your name, include where you work and where you're from, what you do, and then, of course, the question that you have, and if it is directed at anyone in particular. So with that being said, I will ask Maurice to kick it off.
Hi, everybody. I'm Maurice Shama. I'm a staff writer at the Marshall Project. I've been here for about 12 years. I live in Austin, Texas. And, I come to this as a kind of fellow journalist to many of you. I've reported on heat in prisons and thought through sort of a lot of the angles, and that's a lot of what I'll be talking about today. In 2017, I worked on a package that was it was actually a collaboration between the Marshall Project and the Weather Channel, of all places, which at the time seemed very novel to us. The Weather Channel was doing reporting on sort of all 50 states about the impact of climate change, and we decided that Texas was an interesting place to look at the way climate change is affecting incarcerated people. And so that was a long feature story and I think 15, 20-minute kind of news magazine style report about deadly heat in Texas prisons. So through the process of that, I did a lot of interviewing of different kinds of sources, thinking through different kinds of angles on it that I'll be talking about today.
Hi everyone, my name is Ufoma Ovamida. I'm an incoming assistant professor at the University of Arizona, and my background skill set is in geospatial data science as well as engineering. I've been doing work at the intersection of climate, hazards, and incarceration for the last 5 years. A lot of that work has looked like mapping the exposures and distribution of hazards and how they're impacting different prisons and other carceral facilities. I also do community engaged research with community organizers to understand how they can use climate hazards as a lens to fight incarceration and decrease the scope of the carceral system. And I was a co-founder of the Toxic Prisons Mapping Project, which is an online geospatial platform for mapping real-time hazards that are impacting carceral facilities, as well as exploring historical time series insights. So yeah, I'm happy to talk a lot about anything geospatial as it relates to climate and incarceration. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rio Sharf. I'm a staff attorney at Berkeley Law's Criminal Law and Justice Center. Our organization was just founded 3 years ago, but since its founding, this issue of how climate change is worsening conditions in carceral facilities has been core to our work. Um, Other organizations, other people have been sounding the alarm on extreme heat in carceral facilities for a long time. Most critically, the people inside jails and prisons and detention centers, but as well as scholars like Ufuoma and Susie, who we've learned a lot about this issue from, and grassroots organizations like Ella Baker Center that's been publishing on this topic for a long time and legal organizations like, at least in our area in California, Legal Services for Prisoners with Children and Prison Law Office and others. We've tried to contribute to this work by convening people, convening activists and scholars and litigators from across the country to share ideas and share strategies for addressing extreme heat. We've also been conducting some of our own investigations about temperature conditions in the county jails in California which I'm happy to speak about. And we've been studying litigation around this topic across the country and considering effective strategies for litigation in California and elsewhere to continue to address this and to improve the case law so that it's easier for people to bring cases to address extreme heat.
My name is Susie Vassallo. I'm a physician on faculty at the New York University School of Medicine. I got into this about 20 years ago. I was asked by the National Prison Project to look at conditions of confinement on death row in Mississippi. I love the work and the collaboration with a group interested in this. I have been involved in litigation as the medical expert regarding the effects of heat on prisoners in Florida, Texas, Missouri, Louisiana, and that's pretty much it.
Well, thank you guys for joining us. Maurice, I wanted to start with a question for you. Could you talk a little bit about some of the different angles that journalists can tell this from? I imagine that we have people here coming at this from a climate lens, from a criminal justice lens, maybe even from an immigration lens. And so could you sort of walk us through how you thought about how to tell this story and other ways that reporters might think about this kind of storytelling?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the project that I did was, as I've said, a combination of a kind of climate change story and a criminal justice story, by which I mean the Weather Channel is coming at this thinking about, okay, if as the climate changes and there's more extreme weather events of all sorts, one of those weather events is more days of hotter temperatures, each year, and who is that impacting the most? And so I imagine as a climate reporter, which I am not primarily, but you're looking at different kinds of vulnerable populations, people who work outside a great deal, people who are aging, people who lack air conditioning because of the infrastructure in their cities and rural communities. And we just identified, I think, about 10 years ago that prisoners were just particularly vulnerable because they, unlike most people, and I remember Susie telling me this in particular, like have the least kind of control over how like what spaces they spend their time, right? So they're often confined to cells that lack AC. Their schedules at a prison can be very controlled so that where the average, this may sound obvious, but it's worth just highlighting that where, if your apartment does not have heat, there may be aging reasons that make it hard for you to go outside, but there is this kind of option of going outside in a way that is not always the case in a prison. And what we also learned back then was that an incredible amount of prisons and jails and detention centers around the country lack any kind of air conditioning, which is like the predominant way to decrease the medical risk to people. So, the way I think about it is that first of all, you want to think about this. I mean, you may be a national reporter and thinking about where to focus your story, and that would be a kind of a question that I can address later if anyone has it. But if you're in a particular community, I mean, I think the most basic first thing to do is to look into whether the detention centers that are in your coverage area have air conditioning. And if they don't, whose call that is. Because, I mean, if you're treating this as a kind of accountability story, which again, you can turn up or down how much you frame this as a kind of traditional investigative accountability story. But at the basic level, it is someone's choice whether there is air conditioning in a facility. And if there is not, then all of the harm that comes with that lack of air conditioning, it should be called out. And in the case of Texas, for example, it was the Texas state legislature. In the case of many county jails, it tends to be the sheriff or maybe like a county commissioner's court that's voting on, improvements to a particular jail. Detention centers are primarily the federal government, but of course now we are seeing a great deal of housing immigration detainees in both the state prisons and county jails. So it's worth looking into, and you'll find kind of surprises. I mean, in Texas, for example, there's been all this litigation that you've probably heard about, that you'll hear about more today, about the massive number of Texas prisons, state prison cells that don't have AC. But then turns out that actually there are regulations for local county jails in Texas that demand that they be between, I want to say 65 and 85 degrees, right? So within the same state, the state level is, basically cooking people to death at the same time that these local counties are required by the state to keep things in a livable range. So you're going to find these interesting kind of disparities and problems as you dig into your particular state. What I would also say is that when you talk about the harm, there's we talk about this in the toolkit, and you can go to a medical expert like Susie to sort of understand which types of people are at a higher risk. But you, of course, will also see because not every example in the real world will always hew to sort of the data curves. You will also see young and healthy people, right, who succumb to extreme heat. And when we talk about the people who are harmed, I found it helpful just mentally to kind of break it into two categories. The stories that we wrote involved both categories, but and ultimately they're all the same. But one is people who are incarcerated who are like talking about and describing the struggle of living in extreme heat and the medical problems that have come with that for them. Uh, and then, well, actually, I said two. I should have said there are three. So one of them is the people inside. One of them is the people working inside the prisons, right? Because there is a whole kind of angle on this story that is, um, what is it like to work in these facilities? People who work in prisons typically have a lot of clothing on and gear, and although they can go home at the end of the day and have more of a relief from it, you do see, workman's comp claims or other kinds of anecdotes coming out, lawsuits related to working conditions for staff at all of these kinds of facilities. And then the third category is family members, and there are the family members that are trying to help people who are still incarcerated, right? Who, their loved ones who are inside, who are worried about them, and they are often very good sources in these sorts of stories. And then there's also a whole category of family members who have lost a loved one to extreme heat. And so we know that there is, some number of deaths. We can get a little bit more into the science later of how it can be a little tricky to assign every single death to the cause of extreme heat. But just generally speaking, there is a community out there of family members who have lost a loved one to extreme heat in a carceral setting. And in some cases, they have sued over it. And when they do sue over it, you end up having a kind of like gold mine as a reporter because a lawyer is starting to kind of lay out the narrative of what happened. This family has already decided that they want to sort of be in public. And so usually I found that for myself, when I came to those families, they were extremely helpful and cooperative and helped me tell a much richer story than I would have been able to tell just from, documents or names on coroner's reports, etc. So I think those are the kind of biggest picture kind of angles and ways of thinking about it for me.
Awesome. That is super helpful. Susie, I'm going to turn to you in a moment to kind of hear a little bit more about how we suss out like the vulnerabilities and the ways that people are exposed to extreme heat in these facilities and what that does to them. But Ufoma, I wanted to ask you first, what is it about these kinds of, prisons, detention centers, these sorts of facilities that make people inside particularly vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat? I know a lot of your research is sort of focused on like hot spotting, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Maurice touched on some of it, but I I tend to think about the vulnerability to heat in three different spheres. There's the facility level, so that's has to do with the actual building construction, age of the facility. A lot of the prisons that we have in some states are over 100 years old. The lack of universal AC, 44 states don't have universal air conditioning in their prisons as Maurice was touching on. And in lieu of those like infrastructural facility level resources, the only heat mitigation resources are often distributing ice, which might just be one or two times a day in some cases, as some formerly incarcerated people have communicated to me, or access to cold showers, which also varies in how cold these showers actually are. Um, the second sphere that I think about is kind of like what I'm starting to call kind of like an institutional power control regime, where regardless of the actual facility infrastructure that you're in, the staff and the power differential in those buildings shapes individual people's exposure to extreme heat. For example, I've spoken to formerly incarcerated people in facilities where they have air-conditioned units, and per the laws of those DOCs, Department of Corrections, they're supposed to be able to access these respite AC'd areas whenever they like to. But staff get to decide whether or not people actually get access to those spaces. So that's what I mean about kind of this power control regime actually shaping individual incarcerated people's access or lack of access to heat mitigation resources. Further, people's individual heat adaptive behaviors can be punished. Incarcerated people often resort to extreme measures of either, shedding their clothes or purposefully flooding their cells with toilet water so as to create basically a swimming pool to cool themselves. These same behaviors that they're doing just to survive can result in sanctions that can, mess up their time or even result in being thrown into solitary confinement. Um, and then the last sphere is the individual level, which, Susie can talk more about that just at baseline, this population can be more vulnerable to the effects of exposure to extreme heat. And I'll close out, but just by circling back to some of the other facility level and institutional things that I also think about is staffing, and the fact that we have a staffing crisis in a lot of prisons in the US. And that might mean that some facilities are understaffed or just have neglectful staff. And again, in these buildings where the only heat mitigation resources rely on staff mediating access to AC respite room or cold showers or ice. If a place is understaffed, sometimes those things just don't happen. I've heard of prisons and in cases where when it's really hot outside, they actually just put the whole facility on lockdown. So people can't go out to recreation anymore. People don't get to go out to cold showers. And so instead of actually, allowing people to perform behaviors that might help cool them down, they're just punished more and more restricted in their movement and in their agency and what they can do. Yeah, so I'll wrap up there.
No, that's super helpful. Susie, I want to turn to you now to follow up with something that Maurice said. He had mentioned that incarcerated people are often particularly vulnerable to the effects of extreme heat because, unlike you or I, they can't just go outside if they want to, or go to an air-conditioned space if they want to seek relief from the heat. But I'm curious, even within this population, like, are there certain groups of people in a prison, in a jail, even in a detention center who are particularly vulnerable to being impacted by extreme heat? And then I guess sort of the follow-up question I would ask there is like, what are the sorts of questions that you might ask or that you would recommend that someone ask to get a sense of the ways in which extreme heat could be impacting a person?
So the older you are and the more sickly, the more conditions you have, the greater your risk. However, we know from exercising individuals in sports and the military, as well as just people presenting to emergency departments who are in the free world, for example, Louisiana Department of Public Health, all of the public health publishes this, that young, healthy people are also at risk. And I'd like to say that although we think of heat as causing heat stroke or heat exhaustion, there are not nearly as many of those in the free world or in prisons or in carceral as there are worsening of underlying conditions. So even in the free world, whatever heat time, the presentations to emergency departments, the hospitalizations, and the deaths increased precipitously in hot weather. And that is mostly from respiratory disease. So that's because it puts a big strain on the heart, a big strain on with the ozone and different things in the air. So it puts the strain. So although the most dramatic in the prison systems are when people are die with a temperature of 106, 107, 108, their body temperature, which is clearly a heat stroke death. They've died from heat stroke. The people who are dying by worsening of their underlying conditions, and particularly diabetes. Those are so all both the free world, and of course we know that people incarcerated often haven't had the same access to health care as some people of the free world. I don't know if that, but the last general statement I'd like to say, Ivy, is unlike risk about anything else, um, there must be no risk from heat in prisons. You simply air condition the prison, right? So there's no reason. For example, somebody in federal court said, well, if I get in my car, isn't there a risk? Yeah, but that's getting in your car. We know we could be hit by another car. But in a prison, there's no reason to subject an individual to risk, right? You just air condition the prison and there's no risk.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much. I want to zoom out for a second before we sort of zoom back into how people can specifically investigate this issue. Rio, would you mind just sort of talking to us for people who might not be as familiar? I think, many people here are probably familiar with some of the cases, for example, like out of Texas, out of Louisiana. But could you just kind of give us the lay of the land here in terms of like where there's ongoing extreme heat litigation and also how, for example, like a case that is about extreme heat in prison might be relevant to a case that's going on at a jail or going on at a detention center? Like, how are these things sort of interrelated?
Yeah, definitely. Let me try to outline sort of where there's litigation that we're aware of and what the main legal strategies are, and then also what some of the key challenges or takeaways we've noticed are. So, in terms of prison cases, the ones we've been tracking, the ones I'm aware of, are the Texas case, Teed v. Collier, now Teed v. Lumpkin, which is a system-wide challenge of Texas's lack of AC. There was just a trial a few months ago there, and parties are still awaiting a decision. That case is led by the firms of Jody Cole and Jeff Edwards, and plaintiffs include Texas Prison Community Advocates and others. There's also the Florida case, which has already received class certification and is set for trial later this fall. That case is led by Florida Justice Initiative and concerns a single facility lacking AC in Florida. There's the Louisiana case that many know as the Farmline case. Voice of the Experience versus LeBlanc, led by Promise of Justice Initiative and Rights Behind Bars. That case had an unfavorable decision by the court just recently, which I'll speak about in a moment. A Missouri case, Hamilton v. Foley, concerning a nearly 100-year-old prison with no AC. That case was led by MacArthur Justice Center, but unfortunately was had to be dismissed recently. And then there's some activity in California which looks a little differently. It's not like a new case that was filed to address heat, but these long-standing ongoing cases, Plata and Coleman, which have had sort of federal court monitoring for years and years, cases led by Prison Law Office and the firm of Rosenbein, Galvin, and Grunfeld. Those cases are addressing mental health and medical conditions in the California prisons, and they've managed to actually incorporate heat concerns into that ongoing litigation, which is sort of a different way to get attention on heat issues without necessarily filing new litigation. So just really this year, those cases, which already are addressing a lot of wide-ranging issues in the prisons in California, are starting to focus increasing attention on heat. And the judges in those cases have sort of recognized that, yes, heat is related to medical care and mental health care, and thus has allowed some of the discovery proceedings to incorporate heat issues, and heat is coming to play an increasingly important role in those cases, which is another way for the prison system in California to get pushed to address extreme heat. We've seen some litigation concerning jails. In California, at least, the California Department of Justice, the Attorney General here, actually sued Los Angeles County for its jail system, and their case concerned both extreme heat and also extreme cold. There were at least 2 deaths related to hypothermia in 2022-2023 period. Those deaths are referenced in the complaint. That case is ongoing. And then in detention centers, which admittedly have not been our primary focus, we have seen some heat issues, but also many issues of extreme cold being raised in detention center cases. So here in California, there was a rather recently filed lawsuit against the newly opened California City facility. That case was led by Prison Law Office and ACLU's National Prison Project and Kecker Van Nest and CCIJ. And that case concerned cold conditions and already has succeeded in securing a preliminary injunction to address some of the cold conditions and provide people, blankets and better clothing. And the preliminary injunction also, was addressing a lot of other issues there. Some other detention center cases have involved temperature. A lot of them, it's because either the conditions, it was cold, naturally cold, or the AC was being blasted to make people uncomfortable. So a number of cases, including Doe v. Wolf in Southern California, have addressed cold. And then some other cases against detention centers, like I think the so-called Alligator Alcatraz case and others have included heat, but haven't necessarily focused on it centrally. Um, in terms of the legal arguments being advanced, there's really three in particular across all of these cases. Excuse me. So there's the Eighth Amendment. There's sort of cruel and unusual punishment kinds of claims being made in, I think, all of the prison cases. And those can be made under the federal constitution. But that, in a time with an increasingly conservative federal judiciary, that can present some challenges. And so some of these cruel and unusual punishment claims are being made under state constitutions. That was the case in the Missouri litigation, and that's something that we're very much exploring. Like California has a broader protection against cruel and unusual punishment than does the federal constitution. And so a new litigation in California could be brought under the state constitution's protection instead of the federal constitution. And that can also protect us from review in like federal courts of appeal or the US Supreme Court. And then there's also due process claims being brought. Due process matters because due process matters for a lot of reasons. Due process is relevant here because if you have like people who are pretrial who haven't been sentenced yet, they're not subject to the cruel and unusual punishment prohibition. They're subject to due process protection since they haven't actually been sentenced yet. They're not supposed to be receiving any type of punishment whatsoever. And due process also applies in detention facilities since, at least legally speaking, civil detainees, immigrants in detention, can't be punished at all. So any form of punishment that results from extreme heat is a violation of their due process. Whereas somebody who's been sentenced and is in prison or jail, there's a slightly higher bar. They are allowed to be punished, but that punishment cannot be cruel and unusual. So Eighth Amendment or its analog in state constitutions, due process, that can be either under the federal constitution or state constitutions. And then the other claims that we're seeing in a lot of these cases are under the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act. So specifically addressing the way that extreme heat it can be especially harmful to people with pre-existing disabilities. And we're seeing those claims in I think all of this litigation, the Florida litigation, Missouri, Louisiana, Texas, and even the Los Angeles case that the California AG brought. It involved ADA and Rehabilitation Act claims against the LA County Sheriff. So finally, just two takeaways I wanted to mention was just that these cases are really hard to win, and you can sometimes win without actually getting any relief. And two examples are just in the Louisiana case, the farmland case, the judge there actually determined that there was an Eighth Amendment violation. It was cruel and unusual, the level of heat that people out on the farmland were being subjected to. But because of conservative judicial decisions in that circuit, the fact that the prison system had introduced any reforms whatsoever during the pendency of litigation, even though the court acknowledged those reforms were inadequate, the fact of those reforms meant that the court couldn't find that the prison system had been deliberately indifferent. And so you lose even though you prove that there were Eighth Amendment violations. And in the Texas case, which we haven't gotten a final decision in yet, at the preliminary injunction stage, the judge there acknowledged there were serious and probably unconstitutional problems with the lack of air conditioning, but basically decided not to issue a preliminary injunction just because it would cost so much to fix the problem and be such a big incursion of the judiciary into sort of regularly legislative and executive functions. And so In both these cases, the judges said, yeah, it's awful. People should not be subjected to these conditions. These conditions are unconstitutional. And yet, in different ways, they failed to really provide relief. And so these are really challenging cases to succeed, even when the legal arguments are strong.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I am seeing some fantastic questions in the chat, so we are going to pivot to that shortly. But one other question I just wanted to ask you, Maurice, again, for our journalists in the room, is how do you find sources on this issue? Obviously, we are here with a group of some of the most sort of the top experts in this issue, but in terms of finding people who have been impacted by this, where do you even start to look?
There's a few different ways to do it. I mean, the sort of, to me, the simplest first step is to find out if there's an advocacy group in your state that's really focused on this issue. And if there's not, there still might be a advocacy group that deals with prison or jail conditions in either your state or your county. And typically will have heard from a sort of wide range of families or individual people who are locked up. Again, it radically varies. You know, big cities tend to have really, really, big networks of activists who are tracking these things and regularly in touch with people on the inside. If you're in a more rural area, it might just, the sort of thing might not exist. But it's kind of a first step. And then I think a second step is also to find out, again, to Rio's point, and Rio would be, I imagine, the one to ask personally about it, but whether there's any litigation bubbling up in the place that you're trying to cover. Traditionally think of litigation as a really good, just like way into finding sources of people who have been harmed by the issue, and they're already making these arguments sort of in a court, so you can just sort of use that as a way to find them. Um, so beyond that, another kind of more creative or a little bit more in the weeds way that I have found useful and really like when I've wanted to look into a particular jail, particularly it's really useful for jails because and it can be useful for prisons, is to just log into Pacer, which is for those who don't know, the federal court systems, basically tracking service, and you have to pay to use it. And it can get expensive if you do a lot of rabbit hole searching on it. But um, you are able to search for example, the name of a jail or the name of the sheriff who runs the jail. And what you'll often find, I have found that, like, let's say I want to report on a particular county jail, and it's a relatively small, out of the way county where there's not some, activist or lawyer network who is already looking into this place. You search for the sheriff's name in Pacer, and I've recall many times finding a huge list of basically handwritten pro se lawsuits that men or women inside the facility have tried to file themselves. And I have usually found this to be an incredible way to find sources. So I'll like find those handwritten lawsuits where people will talk about the conditions inside a jail or a prison. Actually, this advice goes beyond just heat, but you could, if you were trying to target things more, maybe you could search for, cases filed in, June through September, the sort of hotter months of the year, right? But just doing a lot of searching through. Now, with a state prison system, the number of pro se, which is these handwritten or um, lawsuits where people are representing themselves, uh, some of these get thrown out of court, but it's still just a resource, right, to start finding people and who you could write letters to. Um, in these situations, the a state prison system might have just such a deluge of cases like this that it's hard to find the ones that are about the topic area that you're interested in. So I think this advice is a little more useful if you're looking at like a less populous state or a more rural, less populated county with a smaller jail. But it's just that's a place where I often find myself just kind of like typing in search terms and looking around and just kind of hunting and being surprised by how many people I end up finding. And then when you find people who you think might be good resources, at least in my case, I write them letters. Some states do have better prison or jail messaging services, which are like a kind of a form of email where you pay 10 cents or more per message and can go back and forth with people digitally. But I've often found letters to be a really great first step. So I think those are the big ones. Pacer, uh, looking for advocacy networks and litigation to find families. Yeah, those are the big ones.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to turn now to some of the questions we've got from people who are here listening. Um, some of the questions have already been answered by our lovely panelists, so thank you so much. Of course, if anyone has follow-up questions, if a question made you think of another question, feel free to just put it again in the Q&A. Where I want to start is with a question about finding like data and documentation. We've got a couple questions about that here, but I will read one from Lawrence Cox, who is with the Climate Justice Coalition for California Prisons. And Lawrence is wondering what kind of documentation, data, testimony, or institutional records can be useful to journalists trying to investigate carceral heat and the related climate harms. And so I guess sort of the way that I will interpret this, and Lawrence, feel free to jump in if this isn't quite right, but records, like where can we find records that might be helpful in bolstering some of the claims that we might hear from people inside?
Yeah, and it's going to vary a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, also because just what is provided in a docket varies a lot. So if we're talking about federal litigation, then yes, you can go to Pacer and the dockets are going to look similar from one case to the next. But a lot of times, if you're a local reporter, you're looking at your county superior court or maybe your state court has a system of case management. And whether you get a lot of information from the docket or not is going to really depend on your jurisdiction. Sometimes you'll even have to pay to get certain documents. But yes, you'll usually want to start with the complaint. You may want to look at a preliminary injunction motion, a class certification motion, a summary judgment motion. Those are all going to be really meaty documents that might contain sort of a broad, high level uh, synthesis of the legal arguments and the facts. But then in some cases, like for example, these long-standing cases in California, Plata and Coleman, you're going to have these dockets that just go on for hundreds and hundreds of entries. And like heat issues, for instance, you would find in some very recent documents that are just a part of back and forth discovery battles between CDCR and legal counsel. So start with, some of the documents I mentioned, but journalists shouldn't be afraid to reach out to, counsel in the cases and ask to be directed to documents that are going to be most useful to them. And just while I have the mic, I'll just mention a few ways that we've been getting documents and getting data in our investigation of county jails. These are going to vary. Their usefulness will vary from place to place, but civil grand jury reports have been surprisingly helpful to us. A lot of counties they have civil grand jury reports, civil grand juries that go into the jails and report on the conditions there. And we've learned a lot through those. Public records requests, sometimes you'll get some very stubborn jurisdictions that want to fight against any public records disclosure, but we've actually gotten a lot of public records from a lot of the county jail systems, and some of them have included grievances, which is something you should make sure to ask for. We've gotten a lot of grievances from incarcerated people speaking about temperature, and then the jail's at least accounting of whether and how they responded to those grievances. And then I think I mentioned this in the Q&A, but two other things. One is that law firms that are involved in ongoing litigation, they might have sort of enhanced monitoring authorities. Like Prison Law Office here in California has some monitoring authorities over some jails, so they get really great information through that. And then there's at least one disability rights organization in every state that has enhanced investigation capacities in carceral facilities. Here it's Disability Rights California, but it varies in each state. And so connecting with those organizations, they may have really unique access to I'm not sure about data, but definitely to observation of the facilities.
Yeah, I'll pick up the baton from there. I'm actually going to share in the chat an older academic article that has probably one of the wonkier names of an article you've ever heard, which is Independent Correctional Oversight Mechanisms Across the United States, a 50-state inventory, which on its face, unclear what that really means unless you're in this stuff, but it is a really good beginning list to find out if there is basically what Rio's talking about, this kind of monitoring agency, whether it's a disability rights advocacy group or it's So some states basically have kind of quasi nonprofit or public agency, sort of can vary, but institutions that do some kinds of inspections on jails and prisons, and sometimes they will have stuff on heat, and you can reach out to them. Um, and like in Texas, for example, there's something called the Texas Commission on Jail Standards, which inspects jails, but there's like no comparable thing for prisons, right? Um, so again, it varies, but look into that. I totally echo what you just said about reaching out to the litigators themselves, because often they will be very helpful sources at like digging through the morass of, some of these long, like really long ongoing cases where heat is just one piece of a larger puzzle. And then in terms of data, I'm actually surprised, happily surprised to hear that you've been able to get grievances. That was really hard in Texas, but I can totally imagine that in some other states and in smaller and in counties, if you ask, the sheriff's office for, all the grievances filed in the jail between a certain set of months and how they were responded to, you might get that back in a public records request. That you can kind of think strategically about how to target a public records request so that it's not so broad that they can slow roll you and say, well, that's going to take, years to give you thousands and thousands of records. You could just concentrate it on like a few months of the year on a particularly hot recent, year or something. Or if you're reporting in August, you could say like the last 3 months. And then another kind of sideways one that we found really useful back in the day was to go to the, it's called something different in each state, but whatever state agency deals with workers' compensation claims, and ask for workers' compensation claims from the prison system. And sometimes you can get lists that are coding and tracking things and will tell you if some of the staff members at carceral facilities who were taking workers' compensation were doing it because of heat-related illness or injury, and how much money was given. And I remember thinking that was like a different angle of trying to show the public the sort of cost of this stuff was, this is what we're paying when the state employees are suffering as a result of the lack of air conditioning. So that's another one.
For example, in the federal court in August of 2025, there was a lot of testimony by experts, myself, as well as medical examiners. And so, for example, a number of people who died did not have their body temperature taken. And the medical examiner wasn't either given or didn't know the body temperature. And certainly the medical examiner wasn't provided the environmental temperatures in which this person died. The medical examiner and testified that they would like to know, because heat stroke death is very difficult to say. This was a heat stroke death. You have a body temperature, maybe you do, maybe you don't. It's not like when somebody's shot in the head, there's a gunshot wound to the head. It's like they died of a gunshot wound to the head. So I wish that some reporters on this call would just look at the testimony and ask the question, how can clearly, if you don't know the environmental temperatures, and the MMWR and the CDC has written extensively on the underreporting of heat-related deaths, because we don't have that information. So you can talk to the experts, you can get the depositions from the plaintiff's lawyers. It's all in the public record. It's not like you have to do a FOIA request or anything. And just look at that. Like, this is a big issue, I think, is if you're going to have to report to the state the number of heat stroke deaths, then certainly the medical examiner is responsible for reporting what it is. Well, that they need some facts, right? So how can they not have those facts? Were they not given those facts? Did they not ask for those facts? So I would say that this was I think it's important, as somebody who gives testimony in federal court frequently on this issue, that the reporters of a journalist, if y'all can go and look at some of this, and you'll see quickly the line of questioning brings you to the topic, and then you can get the opposing experts or whatever, and you can raise the issue. How could the public in Texas not expect that the environmental temperatures or the body temperature is made available to a medical examiner who's trying to figure out the cause of death, for
Mm.
example.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thank you. Just being mindful of the time, I'm going to really encourage all of our panelists to jump into our Q&A and answer any questions that you see that might be directed towards you. Ufoma, I wanted to ask you a question, sort of actually a combination of a couple questions that I'm seeing here, but I'll sort of anchor it in this question from Raven McCullough, who's from the California Coalition for Women's Prisoners, which is really about when we know that the legal landscape is maybe not too favorable to these kinds of lawsuits, like what are the other options that are available? And I'm thinking specifically, we've talked extensively about air conditioning being like one of the primary remedies to this that a carceral administration can choose to implement. But what are our other options? Like if a facility, for example, is too old for AC, if the lawsuit to try and get AC isn't successful, like what are the like other avenues of recourse that are available both to people inside on their own, trying to figure out what they're going to do about the heat, but then also for the prison system itself.
Got you. I'll answer what I can of that question, and I'll also combine someone else asked about fans as a kind of secondary measure in absence of AC. And we already put this down, but just in case people didn't see it. So yeah, AC would be the most effective in actually decreasing heat exposure. Fans are a decent option, but there's also burgeoning research that above certain temperatures, a fan makes no difference in the actual exposure that you're experiencing. And that varies also by whether it's a dry climate or hot climate. There's also, beyond the effectiveness of the actual fan or not, there's also the financial access challenge of it. Rio dropped a great article by a colleague, Bharat Venkat at UCLA, where they looked at the cost of fans. In prison, you have to purchase these types of things from commissaries, which is basically just a word for like a vendor, a market kind of thing. But in many cases, to actually be able to purchase those things, it can constitute equivalent of months of working and the income from months of working to be able to afford those fans. And that's particularly challenging if someone doesn't have any additional financial support from family members or loved ones outside. Um, Another reason why that is like also still inadequate is that some facilities don't even have the infrastructure for fans to be an option. At a facility that Dr. Vasal and I actually visited, the solitary confinement unit did not have plugs. So even if they were provided fans, there was nowhere to plug them in. Um, so there's kind of, yeah, just numerous challenges there. For me personally, as someone who's been studying climate hazards in and beyond extreme temperatures and their effects on prisons, I also study hurricanes, air pollution, wildfire, etc., and have been just talking to directly impacted people and organizers on this topic for the last 5 years. For me, a more robust solution is actually decarceration, because AC installation, of course, yeah, like I said, it's effective in actually reducing the heat exposure, but so many other factors that we've already touched on today mediate whether or not people are actually going to have access to that and whether or not it's actually going to be effective. In addition, for many states, that investment can constitute hundreds of millions of dollars or even exceeding $1 billion in some cases. And I think that those resources could be better used interrupting the pipeline into prison in the first place and or providing resources for people returning from prisons, and providing things like affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I also see AC as kind of a patchwork solution that only addresses this one side of the issue of climate and incarceration of extreme heat and doesn't really do much for the other vulnerability of hurricanes, wildfires, all these other things that are where risk is produced not just because of the infrastructure, but by the fact that you have hundreds or in some cases thousands of people in one location with little agency to mitigate their exposure to different hazards. So I see decarceration as a broader and more robust solution to decrease the amount of people exposed to a hazard in the first place. And that can be pursued through a lot of evidence-based strategies that researchers have been talking about for decades.
That's super helpful. All right, I'm going to see if I can try to squeeze in two more questions here. The first one I will ask is from Barit Thorson, who is a reporter with the East Oregonian in Pendleton, Oregon. There's actually a two-part question here. So, Maurice, if you actually wouldn't mind answering this first part in the chat about advice for how incarcerated journalists can cover this in their own facility. But the question I wanted to ask for the group is, Susie, if you could talk a bit about the intersection of poor air quality and extreme heat. I think especially, I don't know where folks are based, but with the wildfire smoke from California that's come down, I think poor air quality is on a lot of people's minds right now.
So I'm not an expert in that. I would say that we know that when air quality and heat, we know that they're related because of the public message that's given out by the National Weather Service. We certainly a little different from your question is the importance of humidity. We know that, right? But the literature and air on air talks a lot about ozone and different things like that, but I don't find myself to be expert in that enough to really answer your question directly.
Yeah, that's helpful. Ufoma, is there anything you wanted to add about air quality as it relates to extreme heat?
I also will, yeah, plead the fifth here. To my knowledge, there hasn't been that much research in a carceral setting. I think that there are some studies of compound hazards in the general population showing increased negative health outcomes on days where you have bad air quality and extreme heat combined. I imagine that that finding would be consistent for carceral settings, especially again because the lack of mitigation factors for both extreme heat and air quality things, as I've noted when talking about these other hazards.
Awesome. And then a question for you, Maurice. Actually, two people with the same question. Wanted to know a bit about tackling this from the lens of a national reporter, since you had mentioned that earlier.
Yeah. And actually, I was just starting to type out the answer to Barrett about incarcerated journalists, which is quick. Every situation with incarcerated journalists is a little specific because of, they're assessing their own risks in terms of asking questions of their authorities. But I do think that if I were talking to an incarcerated journalist, often the failure here, the accountability that you're pursuing, it really has more to do with the state legislature or the prison system's choice of whether to enact certain heat mitigation measures, whether AC, which is like the actual gold standard comparative to ice or fans, right? And so I could imagine if I were, for example, incarcerated, asking the warden or prison officials around me, like, for like questions about what they're doing to try to mitigate the heat from a place of like we all know that you're not particularly at fault for the lack of AC here, right? And to try to like enlist the prison officials in service of the sort of like we're all on the same team vis-a-vis the state, which is refusing to cool this place down. I mean, that might be a little bit Pollyannish, but it's just the thought that comes to mind, and we can talk about it more. As for national angles, I mean, you're right. It's a massive country with a million different situations when it comes to extreme heat and the risk. So my impulse, if I were doing this right now, and it was my impulse when I did the story, back in 2017, is to kind of peg it to the latest litigation, to go to Mr. Scharf here or others and use the litigation in California or Texas or Florida as the anchor for a story where you're already going to have a fairly well casted set of family members or incarcerated people who are like part of the litigation who may be willing to tell their stories. The Weather Channel piece we made, which was again like I think it would probably air it on the Weather Channel as a half hour with ads, but it was maybe 20 something minutes. Uh, all of the people we interviewed for that were already part of the litigation that was in the news at the time, and so it was fairly easy to identify them and to um, go in and know what they were going to say in an interview and kind of do it relatively quickly. We had Susie, who was already an expert witness in one of these lawsuits, to be our expert, right? So we didn't feel like we were having to reinvent the wheel as a national outlet. So I think that's a really useful baseline. And then it's like to the extent once you get in there on a particular state's litigation, you want to try to go deeper by getting into what's going on in a different state or talking to some incarcerated people that the lawyers haven't talked to yet, just for a more kind of like man on the street, just sort of like ambient. I mean, I remember having a great interview with a man in his 70s who had just come out of prison that like some other source connected me to, and I just happened to ask him about heat, and he really described the way from the 1970s to the 2010s it had gotten hotter, and from his vantage point in a prison, he could really tell and see the differences. And he described it. It was almost like listening to someone describe climate change in this like really granular, kind of beautifully specific way, because he had been kind of living in the same cell for 40 years, so he could tell you what had shifted so much. Um, I would think about pegging to litigation, and then I would also think about from a national lens, pegging to time, like time wise. I mean, that just that these stories are going to land more and better in July and August and September. So you start working on one now, and you have until maybe the end of September to publish it. Maybe you publish it on a particularly hot day. I have found, for example, I wrote this story in 2017, and I will tweet it pretty much every year on a hot day. And I noticed that like on, days that are over 100 degrees in Texas, like 10 times as many people retweet that story. And that's just a proxy for sort of public attention being kind of ready for this kind of article to come out and to sort of matter to people because they're thinking about heat already. So yeah, those would be my big broad thoughts about national lenses, but I'm happy to talk offline too if you guys are kind of workshopping different approaches.
Awesome. Thank you so, so much. I just want to be mindful that we are now at time. So I'm going to wrap us up. If there's any other open questions in the chat that any of our panelists want to answer, I will just give you guys like a minute or two to do that right now. In the meantime, I just wanted to acknowledge like one last question that is sort of reflective of a few different questions that I've seen in the chat, which is this question of how do we coordinate all of these efforts? Like how do we coordinate the medical research, the environmental research, the legal research, even like the civic organizing that we see around extreme heat. And I just want to say that I think that it is, there's sort of no one magic recipe for how those things come together to impact the state of extreme heat and sort of the policies around extreme heat. But I think that having these kinds of conversations, having these kinds of panels is sort of a place to start. And as Rio mentioned earlier, there are various organizations that do convening around this issue. And I would say that like for people who are interested in this, whether you are a reporter or whether you work in the legal space, in the medical space, in the advocacy space, that I think getting plugged into coalitions and groups of people who focus on this issue can be super helpful in better understanding both sort of like the multifaceted nature of the issue and also sort of pooling resources to better understand its complexities and how it's playing out in different places. So I'll sort of close on that thought. I just want to say thank you again immensely to all of our panelists for joining us. Me and Michelle have both been keeping track of all of the questions. So if there are specific questions that didn't get answered, we are going to be sending out additional resources that will hopefully answer any of those lingering questions. And of course, please feel free to email us if you didn't get a chance to ask a question, but you wanted to. We will make sure that all of those questions sort of get pooled in so that our panelists will have a chance to answer them. So thank you again so very much to everyone for joining us. And again, the recording of this webinar will be available online, and there'll be more resources related to it coming soon.